All right, let's take you now to this live event that is Dirco is hosting the G20 Sherpas meeting. SABC's international news editor Sophie Mokoena joins us now with more.
Well, we are coming live here at the Department of International Relations and Cooperation. I'm going to speak to the Director General of the department. You know that he was in America recently, where he went to New York, engaging the UN in terms of South Africa's state of readiness to host the G20 summit. But then the DG did travel to Washington, where the team met with representatives of the Donald Trump administration in different capacities. But before we start with the issue of the US and South Africa, the relationship, particularly at this moment, as we saw last night, President Trump imposing those tariffs on many countries, including South Africa. I want to get a sense, DG, this meeting here is quite important. I'm saying this because we also expect the Americans to participate. Are they participating in this meeting?
Yes, the American Sherpa, Nels Nordquist, who is in the White House, was part of the meeting, and he presented the approach of the USA this morning as part of the Troika, so they are participating fully.
Does it suggest that the Americans are taking a much better stance in terms of being on board on this issue of preparations for the G20 summit as the incoming G20 president?
We had a very good Troika meeting in person in Washington, D.C. Myself and the Brazilian Sherpa, together with the American Sherpa, had an in-person meeting. This followed on from an online meeting, which was also positive. The Sherpa basically has committed to working with South Africa. Obviously, the US has got a different policy perspective, and they have committed to being the president next year, which means the handover issues will be important for them. Today, lots of comments were made on the need for cooperation, and continuity has come from all the other Sherpas as well. So I think there is a sense that if you're going to be taking up the presidency, continuity is going to be important. And I get the sense from the Sherpa of the US that they really want to work with us in Brazil as part of the Troika. Obviously, if one looks at the events of last night, for example, many of the Sherpas in the room are very tired because they've been watching the events, and so there's what we must be clear on is that when you look at those tariffs, it's a global tariff. 10% on almost all countries, and then additional tariffs based on assumptions of balance of trade issues. But that's a discussion for another day in terms of how that was calculated. Gives you an indication that the approach by the U.S. administration on issues of trade is a global one. South Africa has come for special attention on politics, mostly on our domestic issues, because of the advocacy of South Africans. AfriForum, that came through in our engagements in Washington, D.C. So the domestic issues was one that we discussed, and we spent some time clarifying and explaining, for example, what can and cannot be done by a no compensation clause. And it was useful because I think it was the first time that we met with the senior officials, both in the State Department and the National Security Council. So we also had the Sherpa meeting. So in essence, we're engaging with the misinformation that has taken place, but obviously we'll have to follow that up to concretize what steps can be taken to correct some of these misconceptions leading to political statements coming out. But we must also just bear in mind that this is, and we're part of this is an overall approach by the U.S. administration on the way they see the world, including trade policy.
DG, when you look at the tone of the meetings you had last week, are you confident that going forward these engagement and consultations will bear fruit? And also, were they cordial? Because when you look at what the organizations that you spoke about, AfriForum and Solidarity and others, they are projecting an image and a tone that there's still serious hostility and it's a war.
Look, we met with the most senior person in the national security infrastructure responsible for Africa, and he brought in colleagues from the Vice President's office and also from President Trump's office, and we had cordial discussions. They put through the positions that they have heard and what they thought would be the remedies. We explained what the history of our country is, the place of redress policies, why it's important, and it was cordial discussions based on facts. And this is what happens when the diplomats do get together, is we will focus on what the facts are, and we will help steer solutions. It's not going to be instant. I think that, the 8 years of engagements by South Africans on a negative basis has obviously created the basis for a sense of issues in our domestic space, which is, completely inaccurate. And we're going to be working to ensure that we also engage through perhaps a special envoy that the president may appoint to take through the discussions that we've had at the official level. We also met with the current highest ranking official in the State Department responsible for Africa, and the team that we've worked with before. And again, I think the discussions were cordial, the discussions were professional, it wasn't hostile. And we could put through our perspectives. Again, the preoccupation was with our domestic issues rather than the foreign policy issues. It was really the domestic issues that we had to explain and engage with.
Some people are saying President Trump is very transactional. When you engage perhaps with White House or the State Department, you have to take that into consideration. It has to be a give and take. Are we likely going to see a situation in terms of the bilateral negotiations and discussions, the tone moving from what we can do and what we can't do?
So let's look at again, go back to the kind of tariffs that's been imposed blanketly across the globe. Some of it we'll have to look at what we do in response, but there may be even avenues for negotiations. If you look at our tariffs under the most favored nation approach, MFN is a WTO term, and it means that you levy tariffs on one country, but you can't do it. You have to be equal in the living. It's amongst the lowest in the world. In the average is about 7.3%. But there may be certain categories of goods that have a higher tariff base. I know that in the U.S., for example, pork products has been an issue for a long time. There may be elements for negotiations on those kind of issues. What we made very clear to them is that we're not going to change our domestic policy around redress, that we're going to focus on transformative constitutionalism as a means to ensuring that we carry forward the project of making our society more equal, dealing with the systemic inequalities that we've inherited over the years of apartheid and before that colonialism. So these redress policies are critical. Also on our foreign policy issues, we made it clear that there's nothing that we are doing wrong. In fact, we are the ones upholding international legal norms. We are the ones engaging in ensuring that human rights are being upheld. We're not involved in any wars. We're not supporting anybody involved in wars that could even be seen as breaching international criminal legal norms. So they've understood that. So there will be no real major shifts from us in a policy perspective, but there may be scope for engagements on trade relations, whether it is a continuation of AGOA, even though the current tariffs almost make AGOA moot in many ways, because it touches on all the issues, on the automobile industry, aluminium and steel, and it's, if you look at the number of countries on the African continent who may be partners to AGOA that have been levied with tariffs, it does mean that AGOA as a vehicle needs to be renegotiated or looked at. And so there is space for engagement and negotiation around those issues. The trade concerns is something that almost every Sherpa has raised in this meeting. This morning, right up until this afternoon. So there's real concern that the G20 is working on how do we make international trade more fair. But you can only do that more fair within a rules-based system. And we've always argued that we need to reform the rules-based system, including the WTO, but we needed to ensure that member states can engage equally to ensure that we build a fair trading system together. And that's the sense that has come through from most of the comments this morning.
And finally, DG, when I spoke to you some months ago, I asked you about the war in Ukraine derailing negotiations during the negotiations to the build-up to heads of state and government meeting of the G20, and finally no communique and agreement. It looks like now the tariffs are likely going to derail the negotiations and diverting their attention to this issue now, while you had a particular agenda and on issues of transformation, including the Security Council and the financial system.
So you'll recall that up to Indonesia, there was no leaders' declaration, and they could not get a leaders' declaration because of disagreements on how to deal with geopolitical issues, particularly the war in Ukraine. What we did in India and Brazil, largely through the kind of drafting South Africa and Brazil was doing, was to use the principles of international law and the Charter to bring everybody together. And that principles as, for example, no acquisition of land through the use of force, the respect for international law, and that brought everybody together. That included the US and Russia and the EU. We believe that we're going to have to now look at a similar principled approach on what are the principles underpinning international legal frameworks around fair trade. How do we rescue the global trading system? And this is coming through. So we'll probably have to look at what can we salvage, through emphasis again on what holds us together. And what holds us together is the rules as they are now. We know that they must be reformed, but it's what we have at the moment, and therefore you'll find that many delegations are putting forward that we need to protect the system, reform it, but we shouldn't allow it to be destroyed.
Thank you so
much. Unilateralism, yeah.
Thank you so much for your time, DG. That was the DG of the Department of International Relations, Zane Dangor. They are currently meeting as Sherpa on the issues that are related to preparations for the G20. But these member states of the G20 are your developed nations that would include South Africa, the only African country. You have the European Union, you have the AU, and therefore this meeting this morning also presented an opportunity for these countries to look at what happened last night, as the DG pointed out that many people were very exhausted when they started the meeting because they didn't sleep, because all of these countries that are member states of the G20 are affected by a decision from the United States of America, President Trump imposing those trade barriers and also tariffs in terms of different countries. And I think this is the story that is going to continue, but the DG is saying that they will continue to engage the Americans. As you know, that he has just returned from Washington, where he pointed out that he met the senior officials of the State Department and the White House, trying to iron out issues that are related to South Africa and the United States of America. Back to you in studio.